Okay, the differences between Glenn Beck, Hannity, O'Reilly, and Limbaugh. Well, Glenn Beck is the most different of all of them. You know, Rush Limbaugh, he was around a lot longer. He goes back to the 1980s. He comes out of like the Reagan years, and he was this heavy set guy. He's from Missouri, right? My dad's family is from Missouri. There's people, beloved members of our community are from Missouri. There's a part of southern Missouri they call Little Dixie. It's like near Arkansas, Ozark Mountains. That's where Rush Limbaugh is from. Rush Limbaugh is kind of a heavy set guy, and he talks like this. I'm Rush Limbaugh. I don't like the liberals. I don't like liberals. They're just not good people. They don't like the country. They're communists. They're traitors to America. And he just kind of emerged, to you, Tyler, said with love from Missouri. He was this like radio host who was notoriously rude, right? And that, Rush Limbaugh kind of appealed to people because there's a lot of people who, they have resentment, right? They have resentment, but they don't have like the bravery to be that rude. And this is kind of the charm of Trump, is it's like they kind of wish they could be that rude. And Rush Limbaugh was blatantly rude. He was just a rude guy. And he did stuff that was pretty awful. I mean, one of the things he would do is he would read the names of people who died from AIDS with applause tracks playing, like he was happy they were dead. That's pretty hateful and nasty. That's a pretty awful, bigoted, nasty, hateful thing to do. But like he would do stuff like that. All right. He was a shock jock. He started out like on music radio, but between music radio, he would make offensive statements about gay people and about feminists and stuff like that. And he was this kind of chubby, overweight guy who would make mean, nasty comments, right? That was Rush Limbaugh, right? So there you go. In addition to that, right, you had, so that's Limbaugh, and he's been around since forever, right? He was around a really long time. Throughout the 90s, he was doing his thing. He had a television program for a while where he insulted Chelsea. He compared her to a dog. Do you remember that? And he was mean. He was just a mean guy. A lot of people that didn't have the courage to be that mean, they would hear him and they would appreciate his meanness. And he was good at kind of ridiculing, like I talked about before, ridiculing the self-importance of liberals, the moral high horse, the sense of superiority you get from liberals. That was his strength. He was very good at lampooning that. And one thing I've often talked about Rush Limbaugh that I think is hilarious, if you watch some of his stuff from the late 80s, it really doesn't age well. Oh boy, it really doesn't age well. Whenever he's talking about, one of his recurring themes was about Gorbachev. Liberals, they love Gorbachev. Why do they love Gorbachev? He's no different than any other Soviet dictator. But these liberals, they think there's something special about Gorbachev. Why do they like Gorbachev so much? Because he's a commie. Because he's a communist. There's no reason to like Gorbachev more than any other Soviet dictator. Why do we like liberals? Why do we like Gorbachev? Well, there's a reason that the liberals liked Gorbachev. There's a reason, Rush, that liberals like Gorbachev. Anyone who hates communists should love Gorbachev, but doesn't age well, right? Because, he's not like doing deep analysis. He's just preaching the Democrats are a bunch of communists and traitors. That's why they love Gorbachev. I'm throwing the Vosh laugh in there for some reason. I mean, that didn't age well. Another thing that didn't age well is that he hated Nelson Mandela. Rush Limbaugh could not stand Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela's a communist. He's a communist. And he would rant against Nelson Mandela as if Nelson Mandela were Che Guevara or something. That also doesn't age well because now the liberal left, eulogizes Mandela and covers up that he was a communist. That's Rush Limbaugh, the mean shock jock. He was good at tearing down the kind of sense of superiority that liberals had. And I will say one thing that Rush Limbaugh has in common with all of these people is that he doesn't play by the rules. He didn't play by the rules, right? Most mainstream media, they kind of play by the rules. They're talking to the American government. They're talking to people in the State Department, and they play by the rules. Rush was an entertainer, and he hit below the belt, and he didn't play by the rules. And so because he didn't play by the rules, he could do stuff that was more entertaining, right? His humor often crossed the line. It was biting, and he didn't play by the rules. And right after Barack Obama got elected. I will never forget this. It was hilarious. Rush Limbaugh got on this kick that Barack Obama was bad. And so he was supporting whoever Obama was fighting against. So when Obama sent soldiers to Africa to fight the Lord's Resistance Army, Rush Limbaugh was on there saying, Obama just sent troops to Africa to fight a group of Christians. They're Christians, and he's fighting the Christians. And he started reading the manifesto of the Lord's Resistance Army on the radio. Like he was supporting the Lord's Resistance Army, this like Christian group in Africa, this armed Christian like militia group that's called terrorists. Like he was supporting them because Obama's fighting them. It was like that's why he didn't play by the rules. He was just doing right-wing entertainment. And that's why Fox was hated, right? Is that Fox and conservative media in general, people call it conservatainment. It doesn't play by the rules. And that's why the establishment kind of always hated it. To some degree or other, there was an element of hating it. Even during the neocon years, when they were just putting out the pure establishment line, they were still hated because they didn't play by the rules. They, Rupert Murdoch at Fox, he just wanted to make money. He didn't give a flying, he didn't care, right? He just wanted to make money. And that's why they always kind of didn't trust Fox News. They always didn't trust them. But anyway, Bill O'Reilly and Sean Hannity are completely different, right? So they didn't come into prominence until like the first decades of the 21st century. We're talking like 2000, 2001. Bill O'Reilly had been this like liberal news reporter for like Inside Edition. He'd been like a TV personality who'd been like a liberal. And he had been like, he was a liberal, and he had been on Inside Edition, and he'd done reporting for different networks. And I think he got fired or something, and then he wrote some novels, and he was just this guy who'd been around like mainstream media for a while, but he was a liberal. Like he wasn't a leftist. He wasn't, or he wasn't a right winger, and he wasn't a socialist. He was just kind of a liberal, right? And he did this show that was kind of like Hard Copy. It was one of these like news magazine shows that was considered a little trashy. They did like, what do you call it? They did, like celebrity gossip, stuff like that. And he was just this guy who was on Inside Edition, right? And he's an Irish guy, right? People remember that famous clip. We'll do it live. We'll do it live. Well, he's an Irish guy, right? I'm an Irish guy. Irish guys, we got a temper, right? He's got a temper. He's an Irish guy. He's got a temper. But Bill O'Reilly, he was just this guy, and then he was off of television for a while, and he wrote like some novels, and then anyway, he ended up at Fox. And at Fox, he and Sean Hannity, I'll put them in the same category. Both of them are Irish, right? Bill O'Reilly, Sean Hannity. They're Irish, and they're from that like Irish cop and fireman urban Irish thing. See, I'm Irish. I'm Irish by heritage on both sides, right? I have a French last name because my ancestry, I'm Protestant. I've always been Protestant. There's like no Catholics in my family, right? And a lot of Irish Protestants have French last names. Right? They have French last names because the Huguenots, right? The French Protestants were expelled from France before the Revolution. They moved to Northern Ireland. The English were using them to kick around the Catholics. And so a lot of, Irish Protestants have French last names. But like my family's been here since before the American Revolution on both sides. And on top of that, my family were rural folks. They were not urban, right? And they're not urban cops and firemen. And actually on my mother's side of the family, they did not believe in drinking alcohol. They were very, 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 very religious. I'm descended from Charles G. Finney, the founder of the Second Great Awakening. Was a pastor, a very religious, and that my family background are Irish Protestants, and they didn't believe in drinking, and they were deeply religious, and they lived in the countryside. So this, even though my heritage goes back to Ireland, I'm a redhead, I've got a temper or whatever, but like, my ancestry, the demographic of U.S. society that I come from is not the same as, when I go into an Irish pub in New York City, right? A lot of redheads. You see a lot of cops. You see a lot of firemen. You see a lot of city officials. You see very big, muscular kind of people, which I am not. I try to work out, but I'm not ripped. You know what I mean? A lot of big, ripped guys who are cops and firemen, and they are Roman Catholic, and they love to drink. They love alcohol, and that is not me, right? And those guys tend to be conservative because they're cops and firemen, and they're in like the enforcement wing of American politics. People talk about the history of why that is. The reason for that is because they talk about how when Irish people first came to the United States, they were considered to be, especially Irish Catholics, they were not considered equal citizens. Being a Catholic was like not respected. And so because of that, instead of being landowners and being WASPs, like old New England money, they got to be, cops. They got to be slave catchers. They called the slave catchers the paddy rollers. You ever heard that expression? The paddy rollers? Those were like the slave catchers. Well, they were Irish, right? The Irish, they can't be rich enough to own a plantation and own any slaves, but they can be the paddy rollers. They can chase after the slaves, right? It was the Irish were the enforcement wing. They were the hired cops, and a lot of them were big and strong and tough guys who liked to drink, and so they could enforce. They could be the enforcers of the order, right? They weren't the ruling class and the owners. They were the enforcers, right? That's where this comes from, right? Right. So that's Sean Hannity and that's Bill O'Reilly, right? Bill O'Reilly grew up in a huge amount of wealth, right? And I don't know Sean Hannity's background, but they're Irish urban cops, basically, more or less. That's what they are. They're Irish urban cops, and they play up this kind of working class aesthetic, right? Bill O'Reilly really worked hard on playing up this working class, thing. Like, I'm an average Joe. I'm just like you. And Bill O'Reilly's whole thing was that, like, he shared the concerns that average people might have that are very, somewhat socially conservative, right? He was worried about, gay pride parades being near schools, and he was worried about, pornography, and, it was kind of a social conservatism. And also this feeling that liberals were these elites, right? And that liberals, they think they know more than you, and they don't respect, it was very much playing up that, building on the Rush Limbaugh thing. But I will say Rush Limbaugh was just mean, right? Rush Limbaugh is on there just, yelling at liberals, and I'm going to play applause while gay people who died and AIDS victims who died names. Rush Limbaugh is just mean. With Sean Hannity, one thing about him is he has like a twinkle in his eye while he's doing it the whole time. Sean Hannity, you can kind of see that, he believes what he's saying and all that, but he's kind of a good-natured guy, right? As much as I don't agree with what he's saying, he means well, right? Bill O'Reilly, on the other hand, he seemed pretty sensible until anyone disagrees with him. And he's got a very, very shallow ego, and anyone disagreeing with him just gets under his skin, and he starts yelling. He's a narcissist. He was a narcissist. And if anyone dared disagree with him, he just got very defensive. How dare you say that? And that he would like fly off a handle if anyone was like making a good point or anything. Sean Hannity is just, he's, and yeah, Sean Hannity does the whole mean working class thing, but he's not in it really. Like, he's got kind of a twinkle in his eye, and he's just he's doing his thing. That's his job, is to be a conservative commentator. And, and I think Sean Hannity is probably somebody that if we didn't talk about politics, I could probably be friendly with Sean Hannity, right? Bill O'Reilly, on the other hand, there's a huge ego there. There's like a huge narcissistic ego that if anyone, he seems pretty sensible, but if anyone disagrees with him, it's just like, how dare you disagree with me? And he flies off the handle, right? And I've seen that before, right? And that the big clips of Bill O'Reilly having these meltdowns, we'll do it live, fuck it, we'll do it live. Or, they're all of those clips are Bill O'Reilly. That's Bill O'Reilly, like someone's challenged him, right? And that's his fear, right? Is that he fears of being made a fool of. He fears someone making him look stupid. He fears being embarrassed, right? Absolutely, John. Absolutely. Right. And that there is a definitely revolutionary Irish working class history, up the raw, and long live Bobby Sands, and all of that, and Joe McDonnell and all of that, but yeah, that's, Bill O'Reilly is very much a narcissist and somebody, somebody who's wanted to be on TV his whole life, really likes his own appearance, that kind of thing, that's, Bill O'Reilly is your narcissist kind of. And that's why he like flies off the handle when being challenged, right? I mean, there's many clips of Bill O'Reilly losing it. We can pull up one of those clips, right? The night is young, folks. I mean, I go on here as long as it takes. So there we go. Bill O'Reilly. And let me see if I can pull up this clip. Oh, we don't have time for that. Anyway, but Bill O'Reilly is a different kind of person, right? So there's Bill O'Reilly. So then Glenn Beck is from a completely different, Glenn Beck is a completely different animal, right? It's almost like there's a sliding scale. So you have Rush, who's just your mean neocon guy. Glenn Beck and Sean Hannity, working, Irish guys who are playing up this working class aesthetic, the cop and fireman, but this kind of anti-establishment thing and whatever. Glenn Beck is a completely different animal. Glenn Beck was a shock jock here in New York, right? He's a German American. He's from a wealthy background. All these people are, right? To get up in mainstream media, they're all from like wealth. They all went to elite schools. These kind of jobs are very competitive. They all try to give you a rags to riches story, but it's bullshit, right? Very few mainstream media personalities didn't grow up in the lap of luxury. Very, very few. But anyway, Bill O'Reilly. Anyway, we're talking about Glenn Beck. So Glenn Beck, German American guy. He's from a middle class, upper middle class, wealthy background, and he was like a shock jock in New York City. Right. When they talk about shock jocks, you listen to the radio. It's while people are driving to work in the morning. People, they drink that coffee. They're trying to wake up. And you've got people like Don Imus, and you have others. And Glenn Beck used to be on the radio in New York City, and he would be coked up. He was using cocaine, and he would, in order to have full energy in the morning, he would snort that cocaine and get on there and, just be crazy on the radio. Right. That was Glenn Beck. And he, obviously, substance abuse and addiction is something that has affected many, many people. And I am not one to judge. Right. And, who am I to cast the first stone? And apparently he developed a cocaine addiction. He had developed a serious cocaine problem. So he went into recovery for his cocaine addiction. And he went into recovery. And through his recovery, he was recruited into being a Mormon. Mormonism, the Church of Latter-day Saints. So he joined the Church of Latter-day Saints. Now, the Church of Latter-day Saints is, very, very much, that is the top religion of FBI and CIA. It's very, it's FBI and CIA, it's that's the Mitt Romney religion, right? It's very, very well connected. Salt Lake City and Langley and Salt Lake City and the FBI, they work hand in hand. So Glenn Beck, and at first he was at CNN, and he was like a right-wing commentator on CNN. And long story short, he ended up on Fox News. But his program was completely different, just completely different than O'Reilly, Hannity, Rush Limbaugh, right? First of all, he never brought on guests he disagreed with, right? That was one of the big things. O'Reilly's whole thing is he brought on guests he disagreed with. And he's like, I think that the Democrats are working for the terrorists. Am I wrong? And then the guest would say, well, Bill, you are wrong, actually. Oh, really? Well, I think, and it was like a back and forth. Beck never did that on his show. Never. Beck would give sermons. That was his thing. He would give these like sermons, right? Where he would just preach, but there were props, right? There were props. Like he would have books and he would read to you, or he'd have pictures. He had the famous chalkboard. That was his thing. He would give a sermon, and he came into prominence just after the financial crisis, just after Obama got elected, the financial meltdown. And his whole thing was Obama's a communist, class warfare, class struggle is going to divide America. There's a communist conspiracy to wreck our economy. George Soros. He was digging into the far right stuff. He was digging into John Birch Society, hard right ideology. Neoconservatism had died. The neocon worldview had fallen apart. And so post neocon, you had the rise of, libertarian ideas, Federal Reserve conspiracy theories, stuff like that. And he was the transition away from neoconservatism into Alex Jones territory. He's not where Alex Jones is at. He's still, he's a Mormon. He's got one foot in American establishment. He was against Trump and voted for Ted Cruz, but he's more in the hard right camp, right? Flirting with it, and really, Mormons were really into the John Birch Society. The John Birch Society was this far right-wing group in the early 60s that thought Eisenhower was a communist, thought Kennedy was a communist. That's where the Mormonism, you read None Dare Call It Treason, None Dare Call It Conspiracy, were books that were, written by Mormons that were arguing that the Communist Party had infiltrated the government. We need to fight against, Marxism, and that liberals deep down are communists or something. And, that was kind of where Glenn Beck was going. And he's a really good speaker, and he could give a very inspirational sermon. And then he brings on a guest who agrees with him, who says what he thinks. One thing that's amusing is, I published this book, during our temporary, pause. I published this book, Capitalism Must Be Destroyed. This is the articles I wrote from 2007 to 2015. I wrote an article about Glenn Beck, for the Workers' World newspaper. Glenn Beck was obsessed with the Workers' World Party. I remember during those years. It was weird. When John Edwards was running in the Democratic primary against Obama, right? John Edwards was running against Obama, and John Edwards was emphasizing class struggle, in his campaign. He would say it's about the very rich versus everybody else and stuff like that. And John Edwards was kind of trying to be like a Bernie Sanders, kind of a left populist against the corporations. He was calling for national health care, stuff like that. And I remember on national TV, John Edwards, he was mocking John Edwards, and he said, why doesn't he just put a Soviet star on his head and join Workers' World Party? You can look this up. Like, he actually said this. Why doesn't he put a Soviet star on his head and join Workers' World Party? And he was always showing, articles from Workers' World newspaper. He would put it on. He was obsessed with the Workers' World Party, probably because he was with that, he's the Mormons, the CIA. He was with that division of the deep state that monitors communists. Right. That's why, Ann Coulter makes odd statements. Like, she knows a little bit too much about communists. It's standard for right wingers to think all liberals are communists, to think communists are traitors, that's standard. But every so often you meet somebody on the right who knows a little bit too much. Like Ann Coulter, for example. In one of her books, she references the October League and Mike Klonsky. Who the hell knows about the October League and Mike Klonsky? I mean, we talk about it on here. We're talking about the new communist movement. That's some really obscure inside baseball. Well, if you dig into Ann Coulter's history, Ann Coulter's father was the head of the FBI anti-communist division, Jack Coulter, right? Ann Coulter's father was involved in sending FBI informants to infiltrate the copper miners' unions of Arizona. Ann Coulter's dad probably knew all the different communist groups in America by name. And, that was like dinner conversation around the table. What did you do at work today, darling? Well, today we sent an informant into the October League. We tried to send an informant into the Revolutionary Communist Party, but the communist work. I mean, that was probably what he was talking about around the dinner table. I mean, Jack Coulter, Ann Coulter's father, that was what he did. He was running the anti-communist division of the FBI. So in Ann Coulter's books, like, she's obsessed with Mumia Abu-Jamal. Why? Because that's what communist groups were organizing around. And that's probably her dad was spying on all the communist groups in the 80s and 90s. And, that's, there you go. So that's Ann Coulter, right? And that Glenn Beck, he had this odd obsession with the Workers' World Party and the Revolutionary Communist Party, and this odd obsession with the ML sects, the communist ML sects. And that was probably because he was talking with the anti-communist wing of the deep state. The section of the deep state that monitors these groups is probably who had his ear, which is interesting, which is very interesting, because, and now the right wing doesn't ever talk about those groups. Those groups don't exist. And, and that used to be a thing on the right, like Trevor Loudon, who talks about Caleb Maupin, right? And there was this section of the right wing, David Horowitz and all of that, that were tracking what the little tiny communist groups are doing. That's not the case anymore. But Glenn Beck, he was oddly obsessed with communist groups. He'd be showing pictures of, I remember during the Arab Spring, this was hilarious. During the Arab Spring, 2011, you had the Arab Spring before Occupy Wall Street. The summer of 2011, it was the Arab Spring was happening. So the Arab Spring is happening. And at the Workers' World Party meeting, somebody brought a map This guy was giving a speech, and he's got a map, and he's showing where Tunisia is. He's showing where Egypt is. So Glenn Beck showed a clip of this on his channel from workers.org, the Workers' World Party website. He's like, you think this started in Tunisia, but it actually started at their office in Manhattan, like the Workers' World Party, this tiny sect of old communist folks, the stodgy old communist group, was leading the Arab Spring or something. It was ridiculous. It was very, very ridiculous. But that's Glenn Beck. And Glenn Beck is like a Protestant minister. It's like a pastoral sermon. And it's a self-help kind of motivational speaker. He tells stories from history that are inspirational, right? And sometimes I will listen to a Glenn Beck speech. I'm very interested in public speaking, oratory. I listen to preachers a lot. I listen to politicians. Sometimes I'll listen to a Glenn Beck speech and I'll just be like, what? Like, sometimes I honestly, as much as his delivery is good, his content is like, really? Like, I heard a Glenn Beck speech. It was at CPAC a couple years ago. And Glenn Beck is doing his speech. And he starts telling the story of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Right? He's just telling the story of, and it's not even the story of the Royal Doll story. He's not even talking about the book. He's telling the story of the movie. And it's like, and he got the golden ticket and he ran and he's just telling the story of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. And he's telling it with a lot of energy. You can tell he's practiced. It's well delivered, but it's like, what? He's just telling the story of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. And then at the end, he's like, and he had the golden ticket. And we have the golden ticket. It's the Constitution. And he starts crying. We have the Constitution. It's the golden ticket. Oh, and he's crying about the Constitution. And I'm just like, wait a second. You made me sit through the whole story of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. You didn't make a single political point, and the whole thing was just a build up to, we have the golden ticket and it's the Constitution. It reminded me of that joke, right? What's the old joke that, like, the old joke, the aristocrats, right? That was like, it was like in the vaudeville days. That was a running joke, right? It was very famous, called the Aristocrats, where it's like, it's a joke that builds you up to a punchline that's not funny. And the joke goes on and gets more outrageous and more outrageous. And the audience is like, wow, this must be really, really building up to something. And then the joke is the Aristocrats. That's what I felt like. And he's going through the golden ticket and he's building up and he's like, he's in this whole story of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. I'm waiting for him to make any political point. It's like, Glenn, get to the point. So what? I've seen this movie. I saw the movie when I was a kid. I saw the remake with, what's his name? Okay, I get it, right? And I read the Royal Doll book. And finally, and he gets to the end and he's like, and we have the golden ticket, the Constitution. And I'm just like, okay. I sat through 17 minutes of Glenn Beck speaking at me for this. Like, I felt cheated. I really felt cheated by that speech. I'll say that much. Glenn Beck, if you're watching, I like some of your material. It's well delivered. That one, not so much. But there you go. I mean, but yeah, you can read articles I wrote about Glenn Beck during the heyday of his career. Ooh, one more thing to say about Glenn Beck, and then we'll go on to the next country. And then we'll go on to the next super chat. This is really interesting, right? So, when it was announced that Glenn Beck's show was leaving Fox News, right? I was living in New York. I was talking with different political people. And I thought, wow, Glenn Beck lost his show. I thought that's a big development because he was like one of the main right-wing commentators and his show it had viewership. Somebody said to me, anti-Semitism. And I thought, really? And they said, yeah, his shows are anti-Semitic. I said, what do you mean? And they said, well, it's George Soros. This evil Jew is behind everything. So it's anti-Semitic. And I said, really? And it seems that the word had gone around, not just among liberals, but even among some more right-wing and conservative Jews, that Glenn Beck was anti-Semitic. And there were a couple times he slipped. And he said things that did kind of sound a little bit anti-Semitic. For example, he got on a kick. He got on a kick against liberation theology. He hated liberation theology. The notion that anyone could be a Christian and a socialist was just outrageous. And so in one of his rants against liberation theology, he's talking about how Jesus would never be a socialist. Jesus could, and he looks at the camera and he says, if Jesus had been one of these liberation theology people, he would have made the Jews pay. And he starts screaming in this angry voice, like, he would have made the Jews pay for what they did. And it's like, whoa, like, that's the Christ killer thing. That's the anti-Semitic trope about they killed Jesus or whatever, right? And I mean, that's an anti-Semitic trope in and of itself. And he's shouting about if Jesus would have made the Jews pay, and he has this like angry look on his face. And the Soros thing, anti-Semitism. So after Glenn Beck's contract got canceled, right? He didn't just go off the air. He continued his show for a little while. But I noticed this as his show was like winding down and going off the air. Every episode was about loving Israel. And that was weird. And the person that told me anti-Semitism, I was like, oh, they knew something. Because, yeah, they said it's anti-Semitism. That's why his show's been removed. And I thought that was like a stretch. But then I looked and I saw there were a couple clips where he clearly crossed into anti-Semitic territory. He clearly crossed into anti-Semitic territory. And then as I was watching the show, as he was winding down, all the episodes were about, and he loves Israel. Oh, he loves Israel. And he had a rally in Israel. He like mobilized his fans to go to Israel for a pro-Israel rally. And I was like, oh, wow, that is the line that he crossed. And apparently that I think there's probably a very good case that that's what ultimately was Glenn Beck's fall. That's why he's not on Fox anymore. Is he ultimately, he outed himself as anti-Semitic a few too many times, right? That underneath his standard neocon beliefs, there was some anti-Semitism, and that's interesting to me. And that person who said that's what brought him down, they may have known something. So there you go. So there you go. But apparently, yeah, there started to be a feeling among a lot of even Republican and conservative Jews that this guy is an anti-Semite. And that apparently I wasn't privy to those kind of feelings, but yeah, Glenn Beck, and the fact that every episode he did as he was leaving was like, I love Israel. I love Israel. Please, he was like, please don't cancel me. I promise I love Israel. I'm not anti-Semitic. It's like, ooh, but they weren't canceling. He was always pro-Israel. They weren't canceling his show because he wasn't pro-Israel. He was always pro-Israel, but there were a few times where he slipped in his rhetoric, and you could see some blatant anti-Semitism in his rhetoric, I think.